The name of the Torah portion we always discuss. In this case, it is also the name of the book. The 5 books of Moses are named based on the first Torah portion that is their beginning. So Bereshit is called Bereshit because the first Parsha is called Bereshit. In our case, Shemot is called Shemot because the first Parsha is Shemot. In addition to the Hebrew names, there are English names: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. There are obviously English names to the rest of the books of the Tanakh, but those are names of people when it comes to the prophets. And even in the writings, the names are translations that are pretty basic. Psalms is Tehillim, Chronicles is Divrei Hayamim. When we look, however, at the names of the 5 books of Moses, in the Hebrew and in the English, they don't translate. Bereshit means in the beginning. Genesis means creation. Yes, of course, the beginning of everything starts with creation, but that's not really a proper translation of the word. And so too for all 5 of the 5 books of Moses. In our case, Shemot means names. Ve'elu shmeis b'nei Yisrael aboyim Mitzrayma. And these are the names of the Jewish people that came to Egypt. Shemot means names. Exodus has seemingly nothing to do with names whatsoever. And nevertheless, we use it. We use that English name. Can we use a translation that in essence is wrong? It's not really wrong because there is an entire other set of names for the 5 books of Moses, with just as much authority and proper source. In addition, name I should say, of the book, let's say Shemot, which means names, rabbinic writing calls it Sefer HaYetzia, the book of leaving. That's where we get the name Exodus. If we're talking about the previous book that we finished last week, it's called Sefer HaBriah, the book of creation. That's where we get Genesis. And so on and so forth for all of the 5 books of Moses. There are 2 sets of names. One is the simple colloquial set where the name of the first Torah portion also names the book. And the second is a more kind of intellectually developed set of names based on the main thrust of the contents of any given books of the 5 books of Moses. And from there we get the English name that we use. Question as far as how we can use an English name and translate from the Hebrew name. But a new question arises. When a single entity, in this case the second book of the 5 books of Moses, has more than one name, still the same entity, therefore the names have to be related to each other somehow. I am called Rabbi Feinstein Shul and Mr. Feinstein if I'm on customer service. That's my name, that's who I am, and so Rabbi versus Mr., I have those roles, both Rabbi and Mr. What's the connection between names, Shemot, and Exodus? The fact that both are proper names is fine, but they are 2 proper names for the same entity. What is their interrelationship? Let me just ask a basic question at the beginning of our Torah portion. When the Torah portion begins with, these are the names that descended into Egypt, that's seemingly redundant. We know who descended into Egypt from last week's Torah portion. We know their names, we know their father's name. We don't seemingly need to be told all of this. It's not enough to say, well, we need a refresher, we need a review before we get into another epoch of Jewish history. The Torah is never redundant, and the expectation is that you're learning Torah well enough that you don't need a review, and if you, for whatever reason, don't remember, you can take the effort and move the page and review from last week's Torah portion from the end of the book of Genesis. So why does the Torah seemingly repeat itself for no reason? Rather, the sages emphasize that this is not for no reason at all. It's not telling you information that you already know, the names of the descendants into Egypt. Rather, it's telling you that just as they descended with those names that we've already known from last week's Torah portion, so too they maintained those names even after coming and being in Egypt. In fact, not only did the Jewish people maintain and guard, as it were, their names, despite being in Egypt, they didn't take Egyptian names, they didn't call their children by Egyptian names. They also maintained their language. They spoke Hebrew and not Egyptian. They also maintained their form of dress. And they also maintained the kind of modesty and morality that would be expected of the children of Israel, despite being in a very much not so pure and modest place. In fact, in the merit of maintaining these four things, first and foremost their names, and the other three by extension, they merited the Exodus. And now we have our answer. What's the interrelationship between the name that comes from that first set of names, Shemot, which means names, and the other name of the book, which is the book of leaving, Exodus? By virtue of maintaining their names, they merited the Exodus. What's the big deal of maintaining their names? And what's the implication of the other three items? Remember, they maintained their names, their language, their dress, and their morality. It's explained that all four of those correspond to the four letters of God's name, the four-letter name of God, the name that references God's infinity. The first letter of the four-letter name of God is the Yud. Yud, though it's not the first letter of the alphabet, happens to be the fundamental component letter of any other letter in the whole of the alphabet. In other words, especially when we look at how a Torah scroll or a tefillin or a mezuzah are written, in other words, what's called the scribal arts, when one writes Hebrew based on Jewish law, there's no Jewish law governing the font of a newspaper or of a note that you're going to scratch and put onto the refrigerator. But there is a lot of detail in the Jewish laws that describe how every single letter of the alphabet is to be written if it's being written for one of those three holy objects, a Torah scroll, a tefillin, or a mezuzah. If we take a look at the way that practically we write any of those letters, you always begin with a yud and then continue based on the form of that letter. However the letter is going to look in the end, you always start with a yud. Yud becomes the foundation of every letter in the alphabet. By that same characterization, the yud is the foundation of anything that we're talking about. It's the foundation of the four-letter name of God. In this case, one's name is the foundation of one's true identity, one's Hebrew name specifically. Remember, they guarded their Hebrew names and did not take upon themselves and did not give their children Egyptian names. By extension, the next letter in the four-letter name of God is that same Yud that is now given width and depth by becoming a Hey. A name word in a language. So in the same way that they maintained their Hebrew names, they maintained their Hebrew language. In the four-letter name of God is a Vav. You take that Yud and you give it depth. You take all that spirituality that the first two letters depict and you bring it down into the practical physical world. Now we're talking about how one dresses. So far, whether it's the name or the language, we've been talking about speech. There are three what are called garments of the soul. One's thoughts lead to speech, lead to action. Speech isn't quite as distal, isn't quite as practical as action. The first two, name and language, refer to speech, but then how we dress is now in the realm of action. The Vav, which takes that spirituality and brings it down. The shape of a Vav is basically a line that descends and brings it down into the physical world. But that's not the name. That's not the end of the four-letter name. The final letter of the four-letter name takes again that spirituality that has been brought down into the physical realm and gives it once more width. That's maintaining their modesty, maintaining their morality. Certainly in the area of action, and in a very corporeal aspect of action, how they are going to behave in those kinds of situations. Because, therefore, what comes out is guarded, they maintained their essential identities, their holiness in all realms, be it in speech, be it in action, covering the entirety of the four-letter name of God. That is in fact what merited that they should be redeemed. Jacob's sons all died. Before Jacob's sons all died, our sages tell us that the Egyptians very much appreciated what Jacob and Joseph had done for the country. When we think about it, without Joseph's proper interpretation of Pharaoh's dreams, everybody would have died in a famine. And without Jacob's blessing of Pharaoh, which comes a little bit later, 2 years into the years of famine, when the entire family descends, he blesses Pharaoh, and all of a sudden, there is no more famine. When we take a look, only 2 of the 7 years of famine actually took place. The reason for that is the blessing of Jacob to Pharaoh, that the Nile should rise to his feet and proper irrigation should take place in the land, and there should be the ability to farm and to produce. All of that happened specifically because of Jacob's blessing. For that reason, while Jacob was alive, while all of his sons were alive, the Jewish people were respected. Once that was no longer the case, then servitude begins. Jacob's descendants in Egypt, however, were fruitful and swarmed and increased and became very, very strong. We'll note that this is, even though overall we're just doing a summary, this is in quotations. Fruitful and swarmed and increased and became very strong is in quotations. The verse there is exceedingly redundant. What's the difference between fruitful and increased? All of that is basically the same thing. But again, on the other hand, the Torah is never redundant. So in the Hebrew, we can identify 6 particular words in that seemingly redundant clause. But again, because the Torah is never redundant, that must be telling us something beyond just a very long-winded expression. And it is. Whereas the norm nowadays, even back then, was to give birth to 1 child per pregnancy, and once in a while there would be twins or triplets or something, but practically 1 each time. The Jewish people had 6 each time. Hence, the verse uses a phrase with 6 seemingly redundant words. A new Pharaoh arose, and he resolved to find a solution to the Israelite problem. When we take a look at the Talmud, the sages of the Talmud, Rav and Shmuel, 2 of the most prominent sages of the entirety of the Talmud, discuss as to whether we're talking about literally a new Pharaoh, or a Pharaoh that wasn't new, but rather had become different and had renewed, had changed his policy in relation to the Jewish people. According to the position that this was a new, literally a new Pharaoh, the verse says, Vayakam melech chodesh, and rose a new king. New. The one who says that he wasn't really new, but only had become as if new by renewing, by changing his policies, focuses on the fact that there was never a verse that says that the old one passed away. So if the old one didn't pass away, this one isn't really literally new. It's the same person, but now he's become as if new. Both opinions are brought in the Talmud, but even more important to our study of the Parsha, both opinions are brought by Rashi. Rashi is there to teach us the simple meaning of the verse, unless otherwise stated. So, certainly the default position is that Rashi, when commenting, is telling you just what you need to know for the simple meaning of the verse. Why do we need both of these opinions? Why do we need this entire discussion? The verse says new. The reality, however, is a question of practicality. It would be basically impossible for any Egyptian, and certainly one that's involved in politics, that's part of the royal family, to not recognize, to not remember the fact that the entire nation was saved by the antecedents, by the great-great-grandfather or whatever, actually by the grandfather, of these Jews that we are now dealing with in Egypt. It's impossible to not know about Joseph. He literally saved the country. So when we consider a king who isn't literally new but has changed his policies, we're talking about somebody who very much on purpose no longer cares about the unbelievable advantage, the goodness that Jacob and Joseph, and really by extension all of the Jewish people, provided for the Egyptians. If we're considering a literal new king, the previous one passed away and now there's a new one, it's also not terribly realistic that he shouldn't know and should kind of forget about who Jacob was and who Joseph was. Both aspects, a purposeful deviation from what is proper and true, or a deviation based on lack of caring, are part of the evil inclination, are part of what we have to sometimes battle against in our challenge in serving God. A person might make a mistake because he isn't terribly careful with something that he should be careful about. That's like the brand new, literal new king that just isn't careful about the fact that, yeah, that's part of Egyptian history. Even worse is if a person on purpose does something wrong. He doesn't care. He on purpose has changed his policy as it relates to a particular aspect in serving God, a particular aspect of proper behavior in life. That's like the king who isn't literally new, but has made his policies new when it comes to Joseph, Jacob, and the rest of the Jewish people. He proposed to afflict the Israelites and impose slave labor upon them, thus preventing them from multiplying. Now, those are two distinct things. Slave labor is one thing. Affliction is something else. Slave labor is just difficult labor. When it comes to affliction is actually something that the Egyptians were very keen on how to do. They required that the men do the work of the women, and that the women do the work of the men. Role reversal in this regard is called affliction, because it's not normal for men to be like women and women to be like men. That is even arguably more difficult to handle than slave labor. It's affliction. And that's what the Egyptians also did, on top of the fact that the Jewish people had to be in servitude. He implemented the plan, and the Israelites were forced to construct storage cities for Pharaoh. These storage cities were designed to fail from the get-go. They were to be built on quicksand. And so invariably, as soon as they got to a certain size, a certain height, a certain width and breadth, the quicksand would take effect, and they would topple, and they would break. And so what did the Jews have to start doing? Build them again. But they're designed to fail. So in essence, they're never going to really finish the job. They're never going to be able to actually build these storage houses. That's the very definition of what it means to have Aveda Beforech. The terminology in the verse is not exceeding fashion, except Perech doesn't mean exceeding. The way that the sages term it and even legally adjudicate it is that they were made to do work that has no possibility of success. They were made to do work that was just for the sake of making them work. By virtue of never being actually able to complete the job, the only purpose in making them work is just to busy them, just to make them do the physical activities of building or trying to build these storage cities. That is even worse than very difficult labor, because when one sees no light at the end of the tunnel, no possible success in his efforts, then there's a complete depletion of morale. And that's part of what the Egyptians did to the Jewish people. But as much as they would afflict them, so did they multiply and so did they gain strength. Pharaoh then summoned the Hebrew midwives and instructed them to kill all the Hebrew sons that they delivered. Specifically Hebrew sons, because his sorcerers had predicted that the Jewish people would be saved by a boy. The Hebrew midwives in this case are Yocheved and Miriam. Yocheved, eventually Moses' mother, would deliver the baby, and Miriam, a young girl, would play with the child to allow the mother to rest. The righteous midwives feared God, however, and defied Pharaoh's orders. The second aliyah. Pharaoh called the midwives to task for not following orders. They answered that the Hebrew women were skilled in midwifery and delivered their babies before they even arrived. God rewarded the midwives for their bravery, specifically by making their descendants leaders amongst the Jewish people. One of the prerequisites of a leader, of a proper leader of the Jewish people, is to put God and himself on the line when it comes to the welfare of the Jewish people. The Jewish people cannot survive and cannot be successful, certainly, without God. And so when God, in this case, would definitely be against what Pharaoh is suggesting, even though it means endangering themselves, the Hebrew midwives did not do so. Hence, they now imbued, as it were, into their progeny's DNA, that proper character trait of leadership. Pharaoh then commanded the Egyptians to cast all newborn males into the Nile. We'll note here that he did not limit this decree to the Jewish males, but to all males, meaning Jewish and Egyptian. The reason is that his sorcerers told him a new, additional bit of information. They come to him on a particular day and they say, on this day we know that the Savior of the Jewish people was born. But we do not know if he is Jewish or if he is Egyptian and will eventually turn against his nation and help them. Because Pharaoh doesn't know which one he could be, he makes a blanket gzeira, a blanket decree. All males should be destroyed, should be thrown into the river. His sorcerers told him that the Savior of the Jewish people would be afflicted by water, and so he says, oh, good, we'll throw him into the river. In addition, however, to saying that kol habein hayiled hayored tashlichu, all sons, meaning again, Egyptian or Jewish, that are born should be thrown into the river, he continues and says, V'chol habas techayun, and every girl, every daughter, you should make live.